August 2023, Blackwood Valley. The heat was a physical weight on the land. It pressed the dust down on the county roads and baked the clay soil in the orchards into a cracked, pale armor. For generations, this valley had been defined by one thing: the Blackwood pear. It was a fruit that grew nowhere else, a dense, honey-sweet pear with a subtle, spicy finish that commanded high prices in cities 100 miles away. Now, the trees were tired. The leaves on most farms were a dull, listless green, their edges tinged with a faint, sickly yellow. The fruit, when it came, was small, often mealy, and lacked the character that had given it its name. The valley was dying, not with a bang, but with a slow, agricultural sigh. Arthur Crawford watched the heat shimmer rise from his own rows of pear trees. He was 72 years old, a man shaped by the same sun and soil that had shaped his orchard. His hands were thick and calloused, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but they were still steady. His face was a map of his years, the lines around his eyes and mouth carved by sun and worry and the quiet, infrequent smiles of a patient man. He stood a little over 6 feet, but a lifetime of labor had stooped his shoulders, giving him a permanent posture of careful observation, as if he were always looking for something on the ground just ahead. He wore the same thing most days: worn denim overalls over a gray work shirt, the cuffs frayed, and a pair of Red Wing boots that were older than the young man who now managed the corporate farm next door. His farm was one of the last independent holdings in the valley. One by one, his neighbors had given up. They had sold to AgriCorp, a conglomerate that saw the valley not as a unique ecosystem, but as underperforming acreage. AgriCorp came in with new equipment, new chemicals, and new plans. They tore out a few of the oldest, most diseased orchards and planted high-yield soybeans, a crop that had never been grown in the valley's heavy clay. The results were, so far, unimpressive. The land did not yield easily to new ideas. The problem, the one that had broken the spirits of so many farmers, was the soil. The topsoil was a thin layer of loam, but beneath it, no more than 18 inches down, was a dense, unforgiving layer of Montmorillonite clay. For decades, it had been a symbiotic relationship. The clay held water through the dry summers and was rich in minerals that gave the Blackwood pear its unique taste. But something had changed over the last 20 years. The clay seemed to have hardened, become impenetrable. Water no longer soaked in. It ran off, taking the precious topsoil with it. The tree roots, once robust, now grew shallow, unable to pierce the compacted layer below. They were, in essence, starving in a banquet hall, unable to reach the nutrients locked just beneath them. Everyone had a theory. The county extension agent, a well-meaning man named Peterson with a degree from the state university, blamed a shift in the pH balance. He recommended massive applications of lime. For 2 years, farmers had dusted their orchards white with powdered limestone. It changed nothing. A consultant hired by the growers' co-op insisted it was a micronutrient deficiency. He sold them an expensive, specialized fertilizer blend from Germany. The trees greened up for a season, a false flush of health, before lapsing back into their slow decline. Others blamed acid rain, climate change, or simply a genetic exhaustion in the pear trees themselves. They had tried new rootstocks grafted with Blackwood scions, but the young trees struggled even more than the old ones, their roots spreading out like desperate fingers across the surface of the hardpan clay. The history of failure was written on the landscape. Fallow fields dotted the valley, their neat rows of dead or dying pear trees like a veteran cemetery. The community had slowly accepted the decline as inevitable, a sad chapter's end. The talk at the feed store was no longer about pear prices, but about the buyout offers from AgriCorp. It was the talk of managed surrender. Arthur listened to it all, but he rarely spoke. He just nodded, paid for his sack of feed or his box of bolts, and drove his old Ford F-150 back to his farm. He had his own history with the land, a history that ran deeper than pH tests and German fertilizers. One Tuesday, a new truck appeared on the gravel road leading to his farmhouse. It was a gleaming white Ford F-250, the kind with a king cab and logos on the doors. The AgriCorp logo. A young man stepped out, wearing crisp, new jeans and a polo shirt with the same logo stitched over the heart. He carried a tablet in a ruggedized case. He was Mark Renshaw, the new regional manager. He was 28 years old, had a degree in agricultural business, and a deep-seated belief in the power of data to solve any problem. He found Arthur by the barn, methodically sharpening the blades of an old sickle bar mower. Arthur looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited. He did not offer a greeting. He simply waited for the man to state his purpose. "Arthur Crawford?" Mark asked, his voice full of a practiced, confident friendliness. Arthur nodded. "Mark Renshaw, AgriCorp. I'm the new manager for the Valley Acquisitions. I was hoping I could have a few minutes of your time. We're making a new round of offers, and frankly, your parcel is key to our next phase of consolidation." Arthur finished wiping the blade, testing its edge with a cautious thumb. He gestured with his head toward the porch of a small farmhouse. "Sit," he said. The single word carried no invitation, only a statement of fact. This is where they would talk. On the porch, Mark Renshaw launched into his presentation. He swiped through charts and graphs on his tablet. He showed Arthur the declining yield data for the entire valley over the past 15 years. He showed him soil composition reports, satellite imagery showing vegetation stress, and profit and loss projections. "The fact is, Mr. Crawford," he said, his tone a blend of sympathy and corporate finality, "the Blackwood pear is no longer economically viable. The soil is depleted. The trees are past their productive lifespan. It's a classic case of monoculture exhaustion." Arthur listened, his eyes not on the glowing screen, but on the orchard beyond. He watched a hawk circling high above the western ridge. "Our plan is straightforward," Mark continued, interpreting the old man's silence as a lack of understanding. "We'll be clearing the old orchards. We'll use deep-ripping plows to break up the hardpan, go down a full 3 feet. Then we'll amend the soil with a high-nitrogen fertilizer and plant a genetically engineered variety of soybean that's been optimized for clay soils. Our projections show a return to profitability within 3 years." He paused for effect. "We're prepared to offer you $150,000 for your 80 acres. That includes the house and all outbuildings. We'll handle all the clearing." He smiled, a closer smile. "It's a fair price. More than fair, considering the land's current productivity." Arthur's gaze shifted from the hawk to the barn. It was a large, gambrel roof structure, its red paint faded to a soft, dusky rose. Its foundation was stone, and its timbers were hand-hewn oak from trees that had been cleared from this very land a century ago. "You want to tear down the barn?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly. Mark seemed taken aback by the question. "Well, yes. It's part of the parcel. It's not structurally sound for modern equipment, and frankly, it's a liability." He gestured dismissively toward the building. "We'd clear everything, give you a clean slate." Inside that barn, under a layer of dust and forgotten tarps, lay what Mark Renshaw would have called junk. Old plows, a buckboard wagon with a broken wheel, and in the darkest corner, a hulking, strange piece of machinery that hadn't been run in 40 years. It looked like a cross between a tractor and a medieval siege engine. It was made of heavy cast iron, with a single large engine and a complex array of gears, chains, and strange, spike-like appendages at the rear. This was the barn junk that Arthur's own cousins, who had inherited a share of the estate but wanted nothing to do with the work, had once offered to sell to a scrap dealer for $150. Arthur had used his savings to buy out their shares just to keep the farm and the barn's contents intact. Arthur turned his gaze back to Mark. "The soil isn't depleted," he said, so quietly that Mark had to lean in. "It's just locked, and your big plows will make it worse." Mark gave a small, condescending laugh. "Mr. Crawford, with all due respect, our agronomists are the best in the business. We've analyzed the soil. The nutrient levels are low, and the compaction is severe. Deep ripping is the standard, accepted procedure." "You'll make a desert," Arthur said. It wasn't an argument. It was a weather forecast. "You'll break up the clay, and the first heavy rain will wash the topsoil right down into Blackwood Creek. Then the sun will bake what's left into brick. Your soybeans won't grow." Mark Renshaw's smile tightened. He was used to dealing with stubborn old farmers who thought their anecdotal experience trumped scientific data. "We appreciate your perspective," he said, the corporate politeness a thin veneer over his impatience. "Our offer stands for 30 days. Here's my card. After that, we'll be proceeding with the development of the adjacent properties, and the offer will likely decrease. Think it over." He stood, placed the business card on the small table between them, and walked back to his clean, white truck, leaving a cloud of dust behind him as he drove away. A few days later, Arthur was at the Blackwood Valley Feed and Seed. It was the unofficial town hall, the place where news and gossip were traded over bags of fertilizer and hardware. Frank Miller, who owned the next farm to the east, was there. He had sold to AgriCorp 6 months ago. "Heard that new corporate fella, Renshaw, paid you a visit, Arthur," Frank said, leaning against a stack of feed sacks. Arthur nodded, inspecting a Clevis pin. "They're offering good money," Frank went on, a defensive edge to his voice. "More than this land is worth, way things are. I took the offer. Me and the wife are moving down to Florida. No more worrying about the goddamn clay." "He offered me $150 for my 80. Another farmer, Dale, chimed in. "Told him I'd think on it." "But what's to think about? Another year like the last one, and the bank will own my place anyway." The men looked at Arthur, waiting for him to say what he'd been offered, what he was going to do. He remained silent, turning the Clevis pin over in his hand. "He's going to try and work it," Dale said to Frank, as if Arthur wasn't there. "Stubborn as his old man was." "More stubborn," Frank replied, shaking his head with a look of pity. His father, at least, knew when to quit. "Arthur thinks he can work a miracle. You still got that old monster in your barn, Arthur? That thing your granddaddy built?" Arthur put the Clevis pin on the counter. "I do," he said. Frank laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Lord have mercy. You gonna plow with that museum piece? Thing probably hasn't run since the Eisenhower administration." The consensus in the room was clear. Arthur Crawford was a fool, a relic, a man clinging to a dead past. They saw his quietness as ignorance, his patience as paralysis. They saw his old farm as a failure, and his refusal to sell as the final, irrational act of a man who had lost his way. They did not know that Arthur was not looking at the past. He was looking at the ground beneath his feet, and he was remembering a lesson he had learned a lifetime ago. That evening, as the sun bled across the western hills, Arthur did not go into the house. He went to the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of old hay, engine oil, and dry dust. He walked to the far corner, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He pulled back a heavy, oil-stained canvas tarp. There it sat, the Crawford cultivator. He ran a hand over the cold, dusty iron of its massive fender. He was not seeing a heap of rust and ruin. He was seeing his father, Thomas Crawford, 45 years younger, his hands black with grease, a wrench in his pocket. He was seeing himself, a boy of 12, standing in this exact spot, listening. The narrative of his memory began. The barn was the same, but cleaner then, more organized. The machine was not a relic, but a working tool, its red paint still bright. His father was pointing at the strange, corkscrew-like tines at the back of the machine. "You see these, son?" Thomas had said. His voice was like Arthur's, low and calm. "They don't plow. Plowing is violence. Plowing flips the soil, kills the worms, breaks the structure. It's a short-term fix for a long-term problem. These," he patted one of the helical tines, "these are different. They drill." He had taken Arthur out to the orchard, to a spot between 2 rows of young pear trees. He carried a soil auger and a shovel. He dug a pit, carefully 3 feet deep, exposing the layers of the earth like a slice of cake. The dark topsoil, then the 18-inch wall of dense, gray clay, and beneath that, a layer of gravelly, mineral-rich subsoil. "Everyone thinks this clay is the enemy," Thomas said, pointing the tip of his shovel at the gray band. "They fight it. They try to break it up, mix it, get rid of it. The extension agent says it's impermeable. He's wrong. It's not impermeable. It's just tight. It holds everything. Water, iron, calcium, all the things that make our pears taste the way they do. The trees want to get down there, but they can't. The clay is too dense. It suffocates the roots." He had crumbled a piece of the clay in his hand. It was smooth and plastic like a potter's medium. The secret of this valley, the one my father taught me, is this: you don't fight the clay. You feed it. You give it what it wants, and it will open up for you. This was the core principle, the central thesis of his family's knowledge. It was a truth so contrary to conventional agriculture that it sounded like folklore. Back in the barn, his father had gestured to the machine. That's what this does. It drills a hole, a narrow one, 6 feet deep. It doesn't disturb the topsoil much, but it goes right through the clay. And as it drills, he pointed to a tank and a system of pumps and hoses. It injects a slurry, a tea. The tea was his father's other secret. A compost slurry made from specific things: rotted hay, cow manure, bone meal, and most importantly, the crushed, dried leaves of the comfrey plant, which grew in a dense patch behind the barn. The comfrey, his father explained, had a deep taproot that pulled minerals up from the subsoil. The slurry was a concentrated meal designed to feed the microbial life within the clay itself. The microbes, his father had said, his eyes alight with the passion of a true believer, they eat the slurry. They multiply. They create little air pockets. They change the structure of the clay from the inside out. They make it porous. The water can get in. The roots can follow. The machine doesn't fix the soil, Arthur. It creates the conditions for the soil to fix itself. Now, standing in the dusty silence of the present, Arthur remembered the final part of the lesson. His father had pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his overalls. It was worn smooth with use. "It's all in here," Thomas had said, tapping the cover. "Everything my father learned, and everything I've learned. The slurry recipe, the maintenance schedule for the machine, the gear ratios for different soil moisture levels. Don't ever lose this. And don't ever trust a man who thinks he can understand the land from an office." Arthur went to the small, cluttered workbench at the side of the barn. Behind a stack of old coffee cans filled with nuts and bolts was a small wooden box. He opened it. There was the notebook. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed and stained with grease. But the ink, written in his father's careful, deliberate script, was still clear. He opened it to the first page. Crawford Cultivator, Model 1. Built 1934 by James Crawford. Engine, Waukesha Model 6B. 1. Serial number 487-33B. Transmission, Fuller 3-speed auxiliary. Final drive, custom worm gear, 90-to-1 ratio. It was all there. A complete record. A physical manifestation of 3 generations of knowledge. The man at the feed store saw a heap of junk. Mark Renshaw saw a liability to be cleared. Arthur saw the only thing that could save his farm. He saw the work ahead. The next morning, Arthur did not go to the orchard. He went to the barn and began. The decision was made. He would not sell. He would not surrender. He would resurrect the machine. His first task was to get it out of the corner. The tires, what was left of them, were dry-rotted and flat. The machine rested on its steel rims, sunk a few inches into the hard-packed dirt floor. It weighed, by his father's estimation, nearly 7 tons. He brought his John Deere 4020, a tractor he'd bought new in 1968, and hooked a heavy chain to the cultivator's front axle. The 4020's diesel engine roared, its tires dug into the dirt, but the old machine only groaned. It did not move. Arthur did not get angry. He did not force it. He understood the physics of the situation. He unhooked the chain and thought. He spent an hour walking around the machine, studying it, remembering. He brought 4 heavy-duty screw jacks, the kind used for house leveling, and a stack of oak blocks. Methodically, patiently, he began. 1 corner at a time, he lifted the machine a fraction of an inch with each turn of the jack handle, sliding the oak blocks underneath. It took him the entire day to raise the whole machine 6 inches off the ground. He worked slowly, deliberately, ensuring it was stable at every step. This was not a job for speed. It was a job for process. The next day, he wrestled the old wheels off. The lug nuts were frozen with rust. He used a 3-foot breaker bar with a length of steel pipe slipped over the handle for more leverage. He soaked each nut in penetrating oil, waited, and then put his entire body weight into the task. Each nut gave way with a screech of tortured metal. Underneath, he found the source of the problem. The wheel bearings were not just rusted. They were fused into solid lumps of oxidized metal. He knew he would have to rebuild the entire powertrain from the engine back. But first, he needed to get it to his workshop, the brighter, more accessible part of the barn. He needed it to roll. He spent the next week rebuilding the wheel hubs. He used a torch to heat the frozen bearing races until they expanded enough to be driven out with a hammer and a brass drift. He cleaned the hubs down to the bare metal with a wire wheel on his grinder. He ordered new bearings, massive tapered roller bearings that had to be cross-referenced from the old part numbers in his father's notebook. The parts store in town couldn't find them. They told him they were obsolete. This was where Arthur's world diverged from the modern one. He did not see obsolete as an end. He saw it as a challenge. He got on the phone, not the internet, the phone. He called old-timers, parts dealers in other states whose names he'd written down over the years. He finally found a warehouse in Wisconsin that had 4 of the bearings he needed, sitting on a shelf in their original wax paper, new old stock for 1950. He paid for them with a check and waited for them to arrive. While he waited, he began work on the engine. The Waukesha 6B, one was a flathead 6-cylinder, a simple, robust engine designed for industrial use. It was C-solid. He pulled the spark plugs and poured a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and acetone down into each cylinder, a concoction old mechanics swore by for freeing stuck pistons. He let it sit for 3 days, tapping the side of the block with a hammer occasionally to help the fluid penetrate. He cleaned the outside of the engine, scraping away decades of greasy grime. He took the carburetor off, a big updraft Zenith, and began to disassemble it on his workbench. He laid each tiny part out on a clean rag in the order he removed it. The brass float had a small leak. He cleaned it, found the pinhole, and repaired it with a tiny dab of solder, a skill he'd learned as a boy fixing his mother's cooking pots. He cleaned every jet and passage with a fine copper wire. The bearings arrived. He packed them with modern, high-pressure grease, a concession to progress he was willing to make. He pressed them into the hubs and mounted the heavy steel wheels. The machine now rolled. With the John Deere, he carefully towed it out into the center of the barn floor, where the light was better. Now he could truly begin the disassembly. He started at the back, with the complex drilling and injection mechanism. It was a marvel of farm-forged engineering. A power takeoff from the main transmission drove a massive worm gear. This gear turned a central shaft, which in turn powered the 6 helical augers. The augers are designed to turn slowly, but with immense torque. As they turned, a secondary system of cams and levers worked a set of 6 high-pressure piston pumps. These pumps drew the compost slurry from a 100-gallon tank mounted on the machine and forced it down through hollow shafts in the center of each auger. It was ingenious. It was also a nightmare of stuck bolts and rusted chains. He worked methodically. He labeled every part with a metal tag, sketching its location in a new notebook that he kept beside his father's. He took his time. When a bolt wouldn't turn, he applied heat from his acetylene torch, a precise, focused heat on the housing around the bolt, causing it to expand just enough to break the bond of rust. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity that was almost meditative. One afternoon, a young man appeared at the wide-open barn door. He was in his early 20s, with grease under his fingernails and a curious look on his face. It was Ben, the young mechanic who had recently taken over the town's only garage after the old owner retired. "Mr. Crawford?" Ben asked, hesitant to interrupt. "My grandpa said you were working on something." "Interesting." Arthur stopped, a large wrench in his hand. He looked at Ben, at his hands, and saw a fellow tradesman. "Waukesha flathead," Arthur said, by way of explanation. "Seized." Ben walked closer, his eyes wide as he took in the disassembled machine. He had never seen anything like it. "What is this thing?" "Soil cultivator," Arthur replied. "My grandfather built it." Ben walked around the machine, his gaze falling on the engine block. He saw the cast-in serial number. 487-33B, he read aloud. He pulled out his phone, something Arthur never would have thought to do, and typed the number into a search engine. "Wow," he said a moment later. "This is an early one. According to a forum for antique engine collectors, that serial number means it was built in the third quarter of 1934. They only made a few hundred of this specific block before they changed the casting. He looked up from his phone, a new respect in his eyes. This isn't junk. This is a piece of history. The restorer had spotted the serial number. For Ben, it was a point of historical curiosity. For Arthur, it was simply the engine his father had taught him to maintain. But Ben's presence marked a change. He started stopping by after work. At first, he just watched. Then he started asking questions. Then he picked up a wrench and helped. He was quick, and he understood machinery. He had modern tools Arthur didn't, like a torque wrench and a set of thread chasers. But he listened more than he talked. He learned from Arthur's slow, deliberate methods. Together, they finally got the engine's crankshaft to move. After weeks of soaking and patient rocking back and forth with a long bar on the cranknut, it broke free with a deep groan. It was a major victory, celebrated not with a shout, but with a quiet, shared nod. They spent the next month pulling the pistons, honing the cylinders, and grinding the valves. They had to machine a new timing gear on Arthur's old metal lathe, a painstaking process of cutting 62 precise teeth into a steel blank. Ben was fascinated. His own work consisted of plugging a computer into a car's diagnostic port. This was different. This was real. While the engine was apart, Arthur turned his attention to the slurry. He followed the recipe in his father's notebook. He harvested the comfrey, letting it wilt in the sun. He mixed it in a large stock tank with manure from his neighbor's dairy cows, bone meal from the feed store, and water from his well. He covered the tank and let it ferment. The smell was potent, earthy, and rich. It was the smell of life. Mark Renshaw drove by the farm periodically. He saw the strange machine pulled apart in the barn. He saw Arthur and the young mechanic working on it. He mentioned it to Frank Miller at the diner one morning. "Yeah, old Arthur's trying to get that relic of his running," Frank said, shaking his head. "The whole town's talking about it. Says he's going to fix his soil with it. Poor guy's finally cracked, spending all his time and money on a piece of scrap iron while his orchard dies." Mark listened, a smirk on his face. It confirmed his assessment of the old man. He was living in the past, clinging to sentimental junk instead of facing economic reality. The observation only strengthened Mark's resolve. He was the future. Arthur Crawford was the past, a past that needed to be cleared away to make room for progress. By late September, the machine was coming back together. The engine was reassembled, painted in its original dark green. The transmission was cleaned and filled with new gear oil. The complex system of augers and pumps was cleaned, lubricated, and reinstalled. Ben had helped him fabricate new grease seals and replace the hardened rubber hoses for the injection system. The day came to start the engine. They filled the radiator with water and the fuel tank with gasoline. Arthur had rebuilt the magneto, and Ben had checked the timing. Arthur stood at the side of the engine, his hand on the throttle linkage. Ben stood back, a fire extinguisher at the ready. "Ready?" Arthur asked. Ben nodded. Arthur engaged the starter. The big engine turned over slowly, once, twice. It coughed, let out a puff of black smoke, and then, with a deep, rumbling roar, it came to life. It settled into a low, loping idle, each cylinder firing with a satisfying rhythm. The sound echoed through the barn, a sound that hadn't been heard in that valley for 40 years. Arthur let it run for a few minutes, his hand on the block, feeling the vibration, listening to its heartbeat. He looked at Ben, and for the first time, the young mechanic saw a genuine, broad smile on the old man's face. The next week, Arthur drove the Crawford cultivator out of the barn under its own power. It was slow, loud, and imposing. He drove it to the edge of the orchard. He filled the tank with the fermented slurry. He engaged the power takeoff. The 6 augers began to turn with a slow, relentless power. He drove into the first row of trees. He lowered the mechanism into the ground. The machine groaned under the strain as the augers bit into the hard-packed earth. But they did not stop. They drilled down, through the topsoil, through the dense clay, 6 feet deep. The pumps engaged, forcing the dark, rich slurry into the holes the augers created. He moved forward 10 feet and repeated the process. It was incredibly slow work. He could only treat the area around a few trees each day. The whole orchard would take him weeks. His neighbors and the AgriCorps crews working on the adjacent fields stopped to watch. They saw the loud, smoking monster, the strange process. They shook their heads and laughed. "Look at Arthur," they'd say, drilling for oil in his orchard. The consensus was that it was the final, pathetic act of a desperate man. Arthur ignored them. He worked from dawn until dusk, his focus entirely on the task. He followed the patterns his father had laid out in the notebook. He was not just drilling holes. He was creating a subterranean network of aeration and nutrition. He was giving the soil back what it had lost. He was feeding the clay. He finished the last row of trees in mid-October, just as the leaves were beginning to turn. He cleaned the machine, greased every fitting, and parked it back in its spot in the barn, covering it with a canvas tarp. The work was done. Now he had to wait. The winter was cold and wet. Heavy rains turned the fields to mud. On the AgriCorp land next door, the deep-ripped soil, now loosened and without the root structure of the old orchard to hold it, began to erode. Sheets of muddy water ran off the fields, carving gullies and carrying away the expensive fertilizer Mark Renshaw had applied. Blackwood Creek, for the first time in anyone's memory, ran brown all winter long. On Arthur's farm, something different happened. The rain fell on his orchard, and it stayed. It soaked into the ground through the hundreds of vertical channels he had created. The soil acted like a sponge. His land did not bleed into the creek. An old hand-dug well near his barn, which had been getting lower every year, began to rise. By January, the water level was 3 feet higher than it had been in a decade. It was the first sign. Spring arrived. The trees in the valley began to bud. On the surrounding farms, the new leaves were the same pale, tired green as the year before. But in Arthur's orchard, the leaves that unfurled were a deep, vibrant emerald. They were larger, thicker, and glossier than any he had seen in 20 years. The blossoms that followed were dense and fragrant. The bees, which had been scarce in recent years, seemed to congregate in his trees. Mark Renshaw noticed. He had installed a network of sophisticated soil moisture sensors across the AgriCorp properties. They were part of his data-driven approach. One morning, reviewing the data on his laptop, he saw an anomaly. The sensors on the parcel bordering Arthur Crawford's farm were showing critically low moisture levels, despite the winter rains. But the Satellite Vegetation Index, a measure of plant health, showed a bizarrely high reading from Arthur's property. The data made no sense. A small island of intense health in a sea of mediocrity. He drove out to see for himself. He parked his truck on the road between the two properties. The contrast was stark, undeniable. On his side, the newly planted soybeans were struggling, their yellowing leaves a testament to the compacted, waterlogged clay just below the tilled surface. On Arthur's side, the pear orchard was a wall of deep, vital green. It looked, for lack of a better word, happy. Mark stood there for a long time, the tablet with its contradictory data hanging uselessly in his hand. He felt a flicker of doubt, the first crack in his armor of certainty. He was forced into a moment of silent reevaluation. His models, his spreadsheets, his entire modern approach had resulted in the struggling field on his left. The old man's ridiculous, antique contraption had produced the vibrant orchard on his right. The evidence was right in front of him, and it was irrefutable. Through the summer, the difference only grew. A drought settled over the valley in July. The AgriCorp soybeans wilted. Their irrigation systems couldn't force water into the baked clay. Mark had a truck in water at enormous expense. In Arthur's orchard, the trees barely seemed to notice the lack of rain. Their roots, now able to penetrate the revitalized clay layer, had reached the deep moisture held there. The pears began to swell on the branches, growing larger and more uniform than any in the valley had seen for a generation. Harvest season arrived in late August. The other farmers picked what little fruit they had. It was the same as the year before, small, bland, and worth little. AgriCorp's soybean harvest was a disaster, yielding less than half of what their projections had promised. The accountants in the corporate office were not pleased. Arthur hired a small crew to help him pick. The branches of his trees were so heavy with fruit, they had to be propped up with wooden braces. The pears themselves were beautiful. They had the classic Blackwood shape and a deep, blushing red over a golden-green background. And the smell, a rich, spicy perfume that filled the air. He took the first truckload to the old packing co-op, the one that still handled fruit for the few remaining independent growers. The manager was a man named George, who was even older than Arthur. George had seen the valley's decline firsthand. He looked at the pears in the bins with a cynical eye. Then he picked one up. He weighed it in his hand. He looked at its color. He cut it in half with his pocket knife. The flesh was dense and creamy, not gritty. A drop of juice beaded on the cut surface. He raised it to his nose and inhaled deeply. "My God, Arthur," he whispered, a look of awe on his face. "I haven't smelled a pear like this since my father ran this place." He took a bite. He closed his eyes as he chewed, savoring it. "That's it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the taste. That's the real Blackwood pear." He took a sample to his small office and tested it with a refractometer, an instrument that measures sugar content, or bricks. A typical pear from the valley that year measured between 11 and 12 bricks. A good one might hit 13. Arthur's pear measured 178. It was a number that was, by modern standards, impossible. The success was quantified not just in sugar, but in dollars. The buyers in the city, who had mostly given up on the Blackwood pear, heard the news. A few samples were sent. Suddenly, there was a bidding war. Arthur's crop sold for a price per pound that was 4 times higher than anyone else in the valley received. His total yield per acre was nearly double the valley average. He had not just succeeded, he had shattered every existing metric of performance. The math did not require a pencil. It was a quiet, undeniable, and total vindication. A week after the last of his harvest was shipped, Mark Renshaw's white truck came down Arthur's gravel road again. This time, it drove slowly, respectfully. Mark got out. He was not wearing his corporate polo shirt, but a simple work shirt. He did not carry his tablet. He walked up to where Arthur was greasing the wheel bearings on an old manure spreader. He stood for a moment in silence, watching the old man work. "Mr. Crawford," Mark said finally. His voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier confidence. Arthur finished with the grease gun and looked up. "I was wrong," Mark said. The words came out plainly, without qualification. "I came here with my charts and my data, and I told you that you were finished. I told you your land was depleted. I dismissed you. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I don't understand what you did here, but I would like to." It was a complete admission of error, a total surrender of his previous position. Arthur looked at the young man. He saw not a corporate suit, but someone who had been humbled by the land itself. He saw someone who was finally ready to learn. Arthur wiped his hands on a rag. "Come," he said. He led Mark to the barn. He pulled back the canvas tarp from the Crawford cultivator. The machine sat there, clean and waiting. It was no longer a piece of junk. It was a symbol. "My grandfather built this," Arthur began. He spoke slowly, explaining the principle he had learned as a boy. He did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you," so he spoke of the clay not as a problem, but as a reservoir. He explained how the machine did not fight the soil, but fed it. He described the slurry, the role of the comfrey, the way the microbes opened up the earth. He explained that the machine was not a solution in itself, but a tool to facilitate a natural process. Then he went to the wooden box and took out his father's notebook. He opened it on the fender of the machine, its pages filled with elegant script and detailed drawings. "It's all in here," he said. The knowledge was never lost. People just stopped listening to the land. They started listening to salesmen instead. Mark looked at the pages, at the decades of handwritten observations, the careful records of rainfall, of soil temperature, of crop yields. It was data, but it was a different kind of data. It was intimate, specific, and earned through generations of direct experience. It had a depth and a texture that his spreadsheets could never capture. He saw the drawing of the helical auger, the recipe for the compost tea, the notes on engine timing. He finally understood. He had come with a generic, one-size-fits-all solution, while Arthur possessed a precise, site-specific key that had been built for a single lock. "This is incredible," Mark said, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "We spent millions on research and this. This was sitting here all along." Mark Renshaw left Arthur's farm that day a different man. He went back to his regional office and wrote a report. It was not the kind of report his superiors at AgriCorp were used to. It contained no profit projections, no talk of soybean futures. Instead, it was a detailed, almost reverent description of the Crawford cultivator and the agricultural philosophy behind it. He argued that AgriCorp's entire strategy for Blackwood Valley was wrong. He said they were destroying the very thing that made the land valuable. He proposed a radical new plan, not to clear the remaining orchards, but to restore them. He requested funding not for more deep rippers, but to build a modern replica of Arthur's machine. He was nearly fired, but the numbers from Arthur's harvest were undeniable, and the losses from their own soybean fields were just as stark. Reluctantly, they gave him a small, probationary budget. They would try his heritage restoration project on one 10-acre parcel. Mark went to Arthur with the news. He asked if Arthur would be willing to supervise the project. He asked if Ben, the young mechanic, could be hired to lead the fabrication of the new machine. Arthur agreed, not for the consulting fee Mark offered, but because it was the right thing to do for the valley. The Crawford cultivator, the old machine that had been dismissed as junk, became the symbol of the valley's rebirth. It was moved from the dark corner of the barn to the workshop, where Ben and a small team began to study it. They took measurements, made blueprints. They used modern steel and a new diesel engine, but they replicated the core design precisely. The slow-turning augers, the high-pressure injection pumps, the 90:1 worm gear drive. The following spring, 2 new cultivators, painted a bright, hopeful green, went to work in the AgriCorp orchards. The process was still slow, still methodical, but it worked. The new normal in the valley began to shift. The sight of the cultivators drilling deep into the soil was no longer a curiosity, but a sign of hope. The talk at the feed store changed. It was no longer about selling out, but about bringing the orchards back. The Blackwood pear, once a symbol of decline, was becoming a story of recovery. Arthur Crawford was no longer the town eccentric. He was a quiet prophet whose wisdom had been vindicated. He was simply the man who had been right all along. One cool autumn afternoon, 2 years after he had first started the old Waukesha engine, Arthur was in his workshop with Ben. The young mechanic was now a master of the cultivators, but he still came to Arthur's farm to learn. They weren't working on the machine. They were studying the old notebook. "There's more in here than just the machine," Ben said, pointing to a page of his father's notes. "He writes about companion planting, about attracting certain insects. It's a whole system. The machine is just one part," Arthur said. "It's the part that was needed most. The rest is about balance." Arthur stood up and walked over to the wooden box. He took out the leather-bound notebook, its pages soft as cloth from a century of use. He held it for a moment, then handed it to Ben. "My father gave it to me," Arthur said. "Now I'm giving it to you. The machine is made of iron. It can be copied. The knowledge, that has to be carried." Ben took the book with a reverence that Arthur knew was genuine. He had not just learned how to fix an engine or weld a seam. He had learned to see the land not as a problem to be solved, but as a living thing to be understood. He had understood the lesson. The torch had been passed. The Crawford cultivator sat in the main bay of the barn, clean and maintained, a working monument to a different way of thinking. It was no longer junk. It was no longer a relic. It was a tool, a teacher, a piece of irrefutable proof. It was a testament to the fact that some things do not become obsolete. They just wait patiently in the quiet dark of a barn for people to remember why they were built in the first place. They wait for the world to come around to a truth the land never forgot.